I think most of you were here last week, but if not, we covered several influences on the church during the first 20 years after World War II as to helping the church realize it has a responsibility to speak to public issues. And the ones we covered last week were the aftermath of World War II and the civil rights movement, and then we were in the midst of talking about Vietnam. Here comes the goodies, my goodness.
I'm going to make sure that Mary Beth sits next to me. She's got something to eat.
It's my pie.
Is that for everyone?
No, not Sherry's. It's for Thanksgiving.
Now we're going to talk about.
Okay, I'm ready now.
Are you
Now that
ready?
she's disrupted everything.
I'm so glad. I was just getting us caught up from last week. I didn't quite finish on Vietnam. I wanted to talk just a bit about two things. One was that we have to be honest that the Bible is ambiguous about war and peace. I mean, you can read passages in the Old Testament, especially when the Israelites were conquering the Canaanites and finding the promised land, and say, well, God was all for war and bloodshed and conquering the people who were not true believers and so on. And of course, unfortunately, there are people today who pick those passages and say, see, we should be doing this against whoever. Lately it's the Muslims, but in my lifetime it's been a whole lot of different people, and you can justify warfare if you look at those passages. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that the prophets, for example, or mostly of the prophets, spoke against putting trust in armaments. They, of course, in those days it was horses and chariots and spears, and they spoke against that. And then Jesus' ethic of peacefulness is so clear that there can't be much question about that. So there is ambiguity in the Bible about war and peace, and it's just a given. And so it depends in part where we turn. Now, as I think I mentioned last week, I won't go into it at length, the early history of the Christian church was very much pacifist. They were against war, but then again, they were a conquered people, and they weren't about to take on Rome, you know. But eventually, Christianity became the official religion under Constantine in the 4th century. And then there was some re-examination of this attitude about war and peace. And the interesting thing is that under St. Augustine and others after him, a so-called theory of just war was developed. In other words, how do you know when it's okay to go to war? And this was the thinking that was worked out on the part of the leaders of the church. If you're interested in this book, which is a good book, by the way, called Just Politics, a Guide for Christian Engagement, nothing to do with everything in it, but it's basically a really good book. He spends several pages talking about the just war theory, and I'll have it up here if you're interested at the end. You can come and look at what he said.
Who is the author?
Ron Sider, S-I-D-E-R, Just Politics. Sider is a new breed of evangelical. The so-called evangelicals, you know, evangelicals in our Lutheran name too, but we kind of look at it a little differently. The word simply means gospel-oriented. But the supposed wing of the Christian church in the United States, which has tended to be pretty conservative, is called evangelical, and they have tended to stay out of the public arena in the past, but more recently have stepped into it. And Ron Sider from that wing of the church has written this, I think, very fine book talking about issues we should be concerned about as Christians. So, Just Politics is the book. Well, now I get to what I was going to talk about today. So, I think you all have the outlines in front of you. There's basically three things again I want to talk about. Well, that's not the right page. There's the right page. I want to talk about poverty and economics. I want to talk about feminism, and I want to talk about ecology. If we have time to get that far, but that's my goal. And as usual, you know, raise questions. I don't even have to tell Ron. Yes, Mark?
Quick question on the war, the just war thing.
Yes.
Is there any justification anywhere in there, or anywhere in the Bible, or anywhere, to wage offensive war as opposed to a defensive war, where they say it's just to go in and attack?
No,
Okay, I just wanted to
there's not.
make that distinction.
Just
right now.
war theory never permits that.
Okay.
It says it should be, among other things, an action of last resort.
Yep.
With after all the other efforts have been made to try to prevent war, and that it should be only waged within limits so that there is not overkill, you know,
Right.
things like that. They use
Yeah.
different terminology. Matt?
Yeah, you said earlier that Jesus was pretty clear about peace, and for the most part that's true, but I remember one verse in the New Testament has Jesus saying something like, I came not to bring peace but a sword, set
You
brother
know
against
too
brother.
much. Yeah, that's true. It's there. However, he was really talking about the need for standing up for what's right in that case when he used that phrase. He wasn't talking about warfare.
Why do you think he phrased it in such a way that it would be easy to justify how Jesus wants us to go to war?
Hey, you think I'm up to second guessing Jesus? No, I'm not. I don't know. I don't know. Except that Jesus often used what we call hyperbole, overstatement, to make a point. I mean, you can see that in a lot of his teachings. And so that may have been a case of it. I don't know.
Dan Weiss might say blame it on the editors.
Yeah. Well, that too, yeah.
Well, actually, the translators, because it was written in the Greek language, there are some phrases and some words that we cannot translate into English. I'll give you an example. The Germans don't have a word for carrot. They don't. They call it an orange root vegetable. And there are
And it's one word, right?
yeah, and there are some phrases that if you literally translate German into English, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you speak German, if it's your first language, you understand what's being said.
Sure.
And it's, you know,
It's that way with any kind of translation.
and
isn't it?
yeah, and when Pastor Margaret had the rabbi here talking about the Old Testament, he said languages change. They evolve over centuries, and he gave the example of booty. In the 20s and past, it was what pirates collected when they raided ships, but today it means something totally different.
Yeah. Yeah.
I won't go into that.
Yeah, we won't.
You don't have to be upset.
I think we all understand. Okay. If we can move then into this discussion of poverty and economics, I wanted to start, as you can see from the outline, hope you all have them, with what I remember, and I told you last week that a lot of this is going to be autobiographical. What I remember was the almost sensation that the book by Harrington, can't remember his first name, called The Other America, had on this country when he published his study of the widespread incidence of poverty. And here it was in the late 50s, early 60s, everybody thought we were all doing great, and neglected the fact that there was a substantial number of people, even in the midst of plenty, who were living in poverty. And it caught the attention of the politicians too. I remember JFK was reported as having read it and being impressed by it. And it certainly caught the attention of many in the church. And so there was a new interest in saying, what is going on in our supposedly affluent society? And the discovery came that there were a lot of people who weren't being equally benefited by the society. So that then led to further study and realization that poverty had its links with racism and lack of education, lack of opportunity, insufficient jobs, or jobs not of a kind readily available. All of these things that, and sexism, we're going to get to that later, but some of the poverty, of course, was single women, either with children or without, living in poverty. It was Social Security was started back in the late 30s, partly as a realization that there were a lot of these widows with very little, if any, income, and that was a very unhealthy situation in a country that supposedly cared about its citizens. So the sexism entered into it too. Well, anyway, there were a lot of reasons. This further led within Christian Church to a renewed emphasis on what was there all along in Scripture, on the ongoing concern for the poor. And the formula is almost routine in the Old Testament that the people of God should be concerned about the widows, the orphans, and the sojourners, who today we would call either immigrants or refugees, because they were the people who were not able to function up to the norm in the society. And therefore the larger society had to care for them, be aware of them, and help them. That's a constant theme throughout the prophets. And more recently, a friend of mine, Bruce Malco, whom some of you might know, wrote a book called Justice in the Hebrew Scriptures. And he shows how each of the sections of the Old Testament emphasizes the need for justice for these people living in poverty. So that was another influence that occurred here, this renewed understanding of poverty and the renewed realization that this is an issue the church needs to deal with. So things began to happen. I forgot. There was a further influence. It wasn't generally known, but those of us who were pastors became aware of it, called liberation theology. And it grew out of the Latin American church, which is interesting. And we have a Latin American pope who is very concerned about poverty. It's not surprising, because in the Latin American countries, for the most part, there was great differential between the well-to-do and the poor. And traditionally, the Roman Catholic Church, very strong in most of these countries, sided with the rich and the powerful. But these leaders began to see more and more that was not consistent with Scripture and with the tradition and history of the church. A number of the bishops met in Medellin, Colombia. I can't remember just when, but it was probably in the 70s. And they came out with a statement, a powerful statement, exposing this reality. Most of us have heard of Archbishop Romero, who became an exponent of liberation theology in the church in El Salvador was, in fact, gunned down because of his advocacy for the poor and the underclass. And out of that statement in Medellin, there was a phrase which you will still see, primarily Roman Catholic literature, but it's worth all of us knowing it. And that is that God has a preferential option for the poor. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Preferential option for the poor. In other words, in the balance of things, God cares more that the poor should be cared for than many other things. Preferential option for the poor. So that kind of thinking, along with what was going on in this country, had a distinct influence on the Lutheran Church, and there are some very specific results. One of which was that in the larger structures of the church, synods and national church, we began to say we have to do something specific about this, and so special funds were created. It was interesting, one that was created here in the synod, which at that time covered all of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan and the LCA, St. Matthew's being a part of that. I forget what they called it, but it was an urban fund that made money available as grants and startup funds for programs that weren't necessarily church-based, but which showed promise of helping people who were poor. And some of the organizations that we take for granted today, like the Hunger Task Force, came to our synod and got money as a startup grant. I believe Project Return was another one. Pastor Joe Ellwanger, who most of you know about, certainly realized when that money was there that that was a place to go to help some of these startups for people who were struggling. And so that was one example right here in Milwaukee. Nationally, the LCA, and I believe the ALC also, created special hunger funds in the LCA, and even today it's called the World Hunger Fund, our ELCA. Now, that was divided. It wasn't all for direct relief. A majority of it, I guess probably 75% or so, went for direct care to people both in the United States and overseas. But a portion of it was kept out for education, because not everybody knew about hunger and what we needed to do about it. And the other part was advocacy, which was emerging in the church because of these influences. And again, advocacy was implemented in this way, one of the ways anyway. A national office and certain state offices were created to have staff people who would both educate and encourage church members about issues of poverty and hunger. And here in Wisconsin, the states were the states where there were a lot of Lutherans, because the political decision was made, we don't have enough money to do it in 50 states, so let's pick the states where there's enough Lutherans to make a difference. And guess what? Wisconsin was one of them. Now at that time, it was the LCA and the ALC, and even though the initial impetus came out of the LCA, the ALC had to be brought along to say, we've really got the churches together on this. And I could tell you some inside stories about that, but that would take too long. Let me just finish. And so these Lutheran offices, they took different names. Here it's called Lutheran Office of Public Policy in Wisconsin, were created as both educational and direct advocacy organizations to get the church's concern, especially about hunger, across to the legislators. And that's still the case today. Now, some issues may tangentially affect hunger, and so they're taken on too. But basically, the emphasis is to do away with hunger. And our office keeps working at that. Matt, you were going to say something?
Yeah, dumb question. What do the ALC and LCA stand for?
Oh, you got to look at the material I handed out last week. And I've got extra copies here for those of you who may not have gotten it last week. There you go. That'll answer your question. So that was some of the direct result of the renewed emphasis on poverty. But then in the 80s, the churches, and it wasn't only the Lutheran Church, became concerned about the larger issue of how our economic system works. And if you recall, the Roman Catholics, with their own Archbishop Weekland as the chair of the committee, developed a very extensive statement on the economy. That got a lot of press. What most people didn't know is that the LCA had done exactly the same thing a year or two before. It's not quite as extensive, and unfortunately never got the publicity that the Roman Catholic statement did. But both of these statements are consistent in saying it's partly because of how we handle our economic system that there are so many poor people. And it called for restrictions on unrestrained capitalism. You might want to look at this cartoon, which I'll hand around, because it's still an issue, and there are people here who don't like the Pope saying these things. But the Pope is speaking out of official study and teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. And our statement back there in the early 80s was very consistent with that kind of statement. It's not well known, and it's from a former church, so it's pretty much ignored these days. But it's there, and it was developed out of this concern. Did someone say something?
Go Bernie.
I didn't hear you.
No, I just said, go Bernie.
Well, as the woman who was here a couple of weeks ago from London Task Force said, we talk about policies, not politics. Well, I thought that was a nice distinction, and it's worth a minute. Well, okay, that's a kind of a once over lightly on the whole subject of poverty and hunger. But I'd like to move on, if that's okay, and ready to move. I think the women are, because the next subject is feminism. You know, you think of some of these movements that are well known in the society as being societal, but they had an effect on the church, believe me. And I'm going to get autobiographical on this one, and I'll tell you a funny story. With the feminist movement came a number of realizations within our Lutheran Church. One was, why aren't there more women in leadership? Why don't we have any women pastors? Oh, yeah, so they did a study of the whole Bible, or at least the New Testament, and the results of the study were, there's no reason for or against ordaining women in Scripture. So, women began to be ordained. And the first one, as I recall, was in 1970 in the LCA. The AOC was soon to follow as a woman, first woman ordained. And of course, that was only the beginning, and then more and more women got ordained. Well, at the same time women were being ordained, which had its own influence, there were also women going into theology and biblical studies, and they began to look at the Bible and the history of the Christian church with some new eyes, you know, that all the men who have been doing this for centuries just didn't have. And out of that came some new understandings. Let me give some examples. Well, no, wait a minute. Before I do that, I want to tell you my story. Actually, two related stories. I was a pastor here at Lake Park Church in Milwaukee in the mid-'70s when this was happening. And believe me, it was influencing me. I was realizing things about scriptural interpretation I didn't know before as the women read what that meant. But it was also affecting the members of the church. And one of the ways that it happened was, in our congregation, the church council said, and I agreed, we should help lead the communion. In other words, we should participate. Up until then, it was only the pastors that administered communion. And so they said lay people should do it, and members of the council should lead the way. So we did, and there were a few women on our council. Now, one of those women, who I would say was a very progressive woman, young, in her probably early 30s, came to me after her first experience of helping with communion. And this tells how the, I don't know, brain waves had been set early. And she said to me, you know, that was an awful experience. I thought I was going to, I think she was doing the wine, I was doing the bread. She said, I thought I was going to spill the wine. And I said, why? What? She said, it suddenly came over me, I'm a woman, what am I doing up here? And she got all nervous about that. Now, that's a very significant statement, I thought. I mean, obviously, I remember it all these years. That she had been so brainwashed by the Lutheran Church that she didn't think a woman belonged up there by the altar. Think of the implications of that. And what a liberating thing it was for this to be changing. Not only for her, but for thousands of other women, I presume. Well, so things began to change in the church. I began to realize, as did many of my pastor colleagues, that there were other ways to interpret things in Scripture than the way we had kind of learned all along. And here's where I want to tell you my funny story. You know the passage that always used to be read at weddings about, it's from Ephesians, wives, obey your husbands. Yeah. Well,
Of course, husbands don't have to be told to obey their wives.
no. Well, my perverse sense of humor led me one week when I realized that that was going to be one of the lessons for the coming Sunday, and there happened to be a women's meeting that week at Lake Park Church. So I went to it and I said, ladies, I want to be sure you're all in church Sunday because I'm going to preach on the passage, wives, obey your husbands. And they were, you're not. Yes, I am. Well, the same woman who had felt so energized or whatever by helping with communion, with a friend, made some, what do you call it? Signs or cards to hold up. And they sat in the back pew of the church, and they had boo cards, yay cards. And of course, I'm preaching away, and all of a sudden up comes a yay. And I said something, they're like, well, I got 2 yays and no boos out of that sermon. And one of the things that I had realized, of course, is the verse just before that passage, if you read it, says, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so it sets the stage for mutuality. And in the context, it not only says, wives, obey your husbands, but husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So it's really a very mutual adoration and love that's expressed there. But, you know, under the male influence, without the female telling us, it had become pretty lopsided. Well, the even funnier thing about that Sunday was that was the early service that the gays went up. And so we're in coffee hour between the services, and people who just arrived were coming up to me and saying, oh, well, a man at the end of that service who was not a member went out and berated me for destroying scripture.
Boo.
And so at the coffee hour, people were coming to me and saying, you know, there's a man outside on the corner telling people not to come to church today because you're preaching heresy. What are you preaching? Well, of course, this was the greatest thing that could have happened. You know, it's like the Catholic Church banning movies. Everybody wants to go see it. So the people poured in for church at the second service. And it was very interesting, the whole thing. But that's just a little funny example of how feminism really had an influence in the daily workings of the church and in the mind of at least one pastor. And yes, I think Peggy wants to add.
Women can speak. I was just going to say that this weekend is the 45th anniversary of the first ordained LCA woman, right, this weekend.
Oh, okay. Good. Thanks for telling us that. So, and another way, and this is much more serious, that began to become known in the church, male-dominated church, was the violence that women were subjected to. Again, I remember distinctly, I don't remember the reason for it, but our synod had a conference for women on this subject. I would have guessed it's around 1980, but I don't remember exactly. And I was at that conference, mostly women, and I was shocked to hear the stories, one after another, of the violence that they had had to put up with in some way at some point in their lives. Being the ignorant male that I just was not conscious of that. And I suspect that I wasn't unusual among the men. Well, out of that came, at our next Synod Assembly, a statement to be adopted, or hopefully to be adopted, about how the church should address this issue of violence. And I don't remember why, but I got the nod to be the person to present it to the Synod Assembly and make statements of support. I couldn't believe the number of men who stood up, mostly pastors, opposing it. And I don't remember all the reasons they did. All I remember was they stood up and spoke against it. It did pass, but boy, oh boy, it was pretty clear how the church had simply quietly ignored this issue, and this was the beginning of change, at least within our area. So all of that happened. One other thing, I think. Oh yeah, this is kind of interesting too. It was somewhere in the 80s that the Equal Rights Amendment was passing through the states to be ratified, and it needed only one more state to make it, and Illinois, I guess, was the last state to vote, and they voted it down. So it got defeated. Well, the LCA, interestingly, boycotted Illinois because of that. They used to go to, this was when the LCA headquarters were in New York. but they already knew Chicago was a good place to bring people together from around the country. So they had a lot of conferences and meetings and so on in Chicago. They switched them to Milwaukee because of that vote against the Equal Rights Amendment, which I thought was a pretty nice thing to do. It never got any publicity, but those of us who knew about it thought, well, that's significant. I wish it had been more widely known. Of course, a few years later, when they wanted to decide where to put their headquarters, some of the people who were for that boycott thought Chicago was the only possible place. It was not very reasonable. So our headquarters now are in Chicago. Any comments or questions on that whole subject? I'm pushing kind of fast here because I'd like to deal with the last issue too. Okay, in addition now to poverty, economics, and feminism, the last one is ecology. And while I'm going to have some things to say about it, I think there's a lot more we need to deal with on this subject in the days to come. It was not a subject that I ever heard at all when I was in seminary in my early years in ministry. The first awareness I had, and I think a number of other people, was when one of our leading theologians, Joseph Sittler, gave an address at the World Council of Churches sometime in the 60s, which he called the ecology of faith. Now, he wasn't specifically talking about what we talk about as ecology, you know, the care of the earth kind of thing. But it was my introduction to the use of that inclusive word for the oneness of things. And it did begin to have an influence on the church, not only in its thinking of internally, but in looking at the whole world and what we were doing to the earth and how we were misusing many aspects of this common realm of ours. So we began to get new interpretations there too. For example, as I've given you in the outline, the Psalms are just loaded with praise for the earth, God's creation, the wholeness of it, the oneness of it, the beauty of it, how God's glory is reflected in it, and so on. It doesn't make the earth sacred, but it makes it the realm, or one of the realms of which God's glory is revealed to us. And I think that renewed emphasis came out concerning the Psalms. And then, of course, Jesus constantly talking about the earth and the things of the earth. The best known line probably is, remember the lilies of the field, and so on, that suggests how God has given us this creation as a thing of beauty to be nurtured and cared for and to sustain life. But then there's the whole question, and I remember getting into conferences where this was seriously debated. Okay, so in Genesis, it says that God gave to humanity the instructions to subdue the earth and, make it bring forth its goods, so to speak. But that word, subdue, was in there in English. And what's that mean? Well, it was taken, of course, by many in Western theological tradition to mean that everything in the earth we can use any way we want because God has given it to us to be ours. Or the whole story about the tree in the center of the garden. Adam and Eve were told you can have free reign, free use of everything, but not that tree. Well, that was interpreted mainly as knowledge of good and evil, and in many cases it was interpreted as meaning, oh, if you eat through that tree, then you're going to understand your sexuality. That's not good. So there were all those interpretations that were pretty common prior to this renewed wondering about the nature of the creation that God has placed us in. And some new understandings, at least for me, came out of it, and I have to believe for many others. First of all, and I'm not a linguist, so I have to take other people's word for this, but the linguists were saying, well, to translate the original Hebrew as subdue the earth and so on is probably not the best translation. A better translation would be care for the earth, use the earth in responsible ways, and along with our whole idea of stewardship, you know, it fits right in that we are stewards of the earth as we are stewards of everything God has given us. And what God meant was care for it, see that it prospers and brings forth its fruits. And as far as the tree, if you look at it a different way, God was saying, you have freedom to use everything here in the garden, but not the tree in the center of the garden. It's a matter of limits. There are limits to our human capability, our human freedom, our human imagination, if you will, and certainly to our greed. And I think that renewed understanding of how we interpret the whole Garden of Eden story has had an influence in the decades since these things came out. In reinterpretation, that it's a matter of caring for, not subduing or conquering the earth, but caring for it, managing it, using it well. And the tree, what is the difference between knowledge of good and evil? Well, in part, it's the realization that we are finite human beings and there are limits, and God has placed those limits on us as to what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing. Which is a pretty positive interpretation when you're looking at ecology, that the whole is one system, and that we need to have limits in how we use that one system. And as I said to begin with, there's a lot more we need to say about this. Now, along with this realization of ecology, you remember the creation of Earth Day. Was that 1970? I think so. It was about the time I was in campus ministry, and believe me, it had a huge popularity on campuses. The students were really ready for many of them were ready to hear this message of caring for the earth. And so it kind of filtered over into the church. And I think a lot of the people who became later leaders in congregations who had been students at the time of the development of Earth Day took this concern with them. And we can see it here at St. Matthew's. I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things I remember, which was very controversial, was the limits to growth that came out of this. I think someone actually wrote a book by that title. And there were furious debates back and forth. I was actually at a conference of some kind where they debated this back and forth, because there were the I guess, free market people who said, there are no limits, we can expand and expand and expand. And there were the others who said, there are limits and we have to be realistic about them. We have to develop our economics and our social life and so on within the reasonable possibilities of those limits. And so that was a huge debate. I don't hear a lot about that anymore, but that was one of the big debates as a result of this new emphasis on ecology. And it went on within the church. I suppose, even though it was at this time that the mega churches were blossoming, the limits to growth had some influence within the church too, but I think it had much more application to the society than to the church in terms of its growth. Well, as far as more at home, what's happened, obviously there have been good results from this new emphasis on ecology. St. Matthew's is a leading congregation in this regard. All of the measures that have been taken here to conserve energy, new lighting, panels in the roof. I'm not even aware of everything that's been done, but I know that here at St. Matthew's there's been a lot of saving of money by implementing these changes. But it's not only the money that counts, it's the fact that in this total picture of approaching devastation, we're doing something to cut down on the carbon that we emit and that kind of thing. So I know many other churches have done that too. Institutions of the church have done it. So it has had an influence in that regard. But where I want to leave this is to say what we haven't done as a church, and I think that's what's facing us, is to say, what does the gospel message have to say about our economics, our social life, and all of the ways in which we treat God's gift of creation. There's a lot more to be said there. I don't know if any of you have read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. But if you read it, you'll be convinced something needs to be done. Now, she doesn't bring in religion at all. And I think that's too bad. I mean, she not only tells the problem, but speaks about some of the solutions. I think part of the solution is our message, our witness, if you will, that this is God's creation and that we have to take that into account in how we treat everything within the whole unisystem which the earth is. So I'm giving you a hint that there may be some more talks coming in the spring. There's so much that could be said. I'm going to end with this quote that I think is at the end of your thing. I gave it out last week too, but I neglected to say who actually said it, and that was Reinhold Niebuhr, a very prominent Christian theologian, mid-20th century in the United States. But it's quoted in this book about George Kennan, and the quote is, "The gospel cannot be preached with truth and power if it does not challenge the pretensions and pride, not only of intellectuals, but of nations, cultures, civilizations, economic and political systems." And that's pretty inclusive. "The good fortune of America and its power place it under the most grievous temptations to self-adulation." Interesting turn of phrase. We live in the United States. I think this statement is an accurate statement about our nation and us and the gospel. And so we really need to think about its implications in a whole lot of things. And I've tried to say how we've come from where we didn't bother much with the concerns of society to where we care a great deal. And that's good. But we got more to do. So, well, I don't know, that's once over lately. Any comments or questions?
Yep. On the hunger, I just wanted to mention one thing, and Dave can verify this. We volunteer for the Just One More Meal program. Not only are there hungry people, but what was astounding was how much food was thrown away. And it started right here at St. Matthew's with one caterer. We get, what would you say, Dave, hundreds of pounds of food a week that we repackage, and more churches are coming forward with hungry people. And it's just amazing. It's very rewarding for, I know Dave feels the same way, that we can do something for people we don't even know. They never know us. Pastor Mary Martha at HEPA, the church says, you guys have to come down. We want them. I said, no. I said, we're just workers. I said, what they need to know is that God provides for them. We're just the workers. And the other thing I wanted to mention was the feminism, and this is a cute story. I always watch pro football games, and you always see the guy with the red, white, and blue wig, and he's holding up the sign, John 3:16. Now, everybody knows what John 3:16 is. I'm watching the guy kick an extra point, and here's just an average guy, and he's holding a sign in the end zone that says Proverbs 21:9. I had to check that one out.
So would we all.
Proverbs 21:9 says it is, and if you know how Hebrew houses were built, they have flat roofs where you could sit, and then areas where they kept animals. Proverbs 21:9 says it is better for the man to live at the corner of this roof than with a troublesome woman.
And what's that have to do with
He must have been
kicking the
going
point?
through a divorce.
Yeah, people like to quote scripture to their own liking. Right.
I've got a comment to make. Earlier on in your discussion, you had said that you were talking about something that said, there is support, but it's not sacred. Now that, I guess I would take,
I said what?
the earth is not sacred. I don't know if you
What did I say?
Earth is not sacred.
The earth is not
The
sacred.
earth is not sacred.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did say that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
and I guess I would beg to differ about that a little bit from the standpoint that the earth is really kind of the source of creation and sustenance. It's where we cannot survive without it. It's what everything that grows naturally, we cannot do that without nature. And if you look at like Native American beliefs and stuff, the earth is entirely sacred. Their whole belief system is based around the sanctity of the earth, and many other religions and belief systems have come out of that. So I'd like, what do you base that on, that it's not sacred?
Well, yeah, I could see where it could be misunderstood. What I meant was the earth isn't God.
Oh,
Because there are those who say that the spirit in the tree is God, the spirit in the earth is God. And I think we need to keep a distinction. God is distinct from the earth. God alone is holy.
what about God's oneness with spirits,
Well,
spirituality?
everything God has
within us.
created is one,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't say it's God. God is
Well,
over.
God is beyond that. Yes,
Yes,
it's not, that's
yeah,
not the sum
yeah,
total of God.
yeah, yeah.
Part. Okay.
That's
part of God.
That's basically what I meant.
Oh, okay.
But,
that I understand.
everything shares God's sacredness in another sense. So sure, it's holy in the sense that it derives from God, even as we are holy,
Yeah.
as we are sacred. We are
Absolutely.
all saints, and that's what that really means. Saints in Scripture are not people who are better than everybody else. Saints are the people who know that they've been redeemed by God.
And the parallel between what Jesus was saying, the oneness of, mankind and God, and again, going back to Native Americans, they take culture and beliefs, they take it even further, that all spirits are one. There's a oneness connection between all spirits, they have beliefs that mountains have spirits, lakes have spirits, and things like this. They're associated with them. Very different than humans and animals, obviously, but
And
still
they're
it's
not
a
the only
spirit.
ones. Today, tribal groups in Africa, for instance,
Yeah.
have similar beliefs.
Absolutely, and the Aborigine beliefs in Australia are something too, and it's that kind of living belief, because that means everything's alive to some extent. It's not just this dead thing. We look at a rock and that's like a dead thing. It's nothing to it. It's just something to be used. Again, go back to here, you're using the world as opposed to caring for it.
Right.
So it's
Certainly true. And some of these distinctions are a little hard, I think, to.
And, we're still trying to understand it. We obviously do not understand it. We just scratch the surface on all there is to know, and we're going to continue to try to struggle and understand.
Well, sure.
Yeah,
We
we're going
never
away
get
from it.
beyond the struggle. Yes.
Just one comment, when I hear the initiatives that are discussed here, I think about the environment we're in today, or the culture and environment we're in today, and the culture and environment that these things evolved and came out of. And Pastor Margaret has spoken to this before. I think the challenge to these initiatives is the sense of individualism we have in the United States, not the sense of community and communal, collective interest. And there's a dialogue that's starting. A lot of times it comes out of our political discourse, but Bernie Sanders has sort of forced communities to use the word socialism and to think about what that means. Now there is a generational gap between what we perceive, socialism as. There's European definitions of socialism, Eastern, Asian, but a lot of these require the service of community. And when someone starts to play with the words, they say community, that's communism, all of a sudden they start to recoil, okay? Or the stigma around, the larger self-good. So I think there is a challenge to these initiatives today that may or may not be as strong as they were in the 70s and the 80s as they were evolving. But I think in a different way they're challenged.
Oh, they're all with us today. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're right about the community. That is such an important vision of human life in Scripture. And didn't Martin Luther King use the phrase the blessed community? Wasn't that one that he often used? I think so. Anyway, that kind of says it, that's why we don't give in to hate. That's why we don't give in to retaliation. Because we recognize that we are part of the same community. And that would be a good word today, those who want to drive ISIS into the ground, okay, but hating and destructiveness are not the way to go. Thank you for pointing that out. Very important concept, community. We don't hear it very often, do we? In our public discourse.
I think in this church we do,
Oh, yeah, but I'm thinking
but
about
not
the
in a
larger
public
society.
discourse, no.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for being patient with me. I finally got through.